The English Civil War. It summons images of flamboyant cavaliers with feathered hats and stern parliamentarians in sensible haircuts. A noble, if slightly damp, conflict between brothers. This is, of course, a deeply comforting and entirely inaccurate picture. It was less a disagreement over tea and more a nationwide nervous breakdown with pikes. The real story isn't just found in grand battles like Edgehill or Marston Moor, where men lined up politely to kill each other. No, the truly characteristic feature of the war was the siege. And the siege had a nasty habit of ending not with a handshake, but with a massacre. It turns out that when you trap thousands of angry, hungry people in a town for months, their eventual reunion with the outside world is rarely a pleasant one. Before we dive into the creative violence, we need to talk about a quaint 17th century concept called quarter. Giving quarter meant that if an enemy soldier surrendered, you magnanimously agreed not to immediately stab him. This was the civilized rule. Unless, of course, the garrison had refused an initial summons to surrender. In that case, if you had to storm the walls, all bets were off. Suddenly, the laws of war allowed for what was politely termed no quarter given. This was a fantastic loophole for any commander who wanted to let his poorly paid, frustrated soldiers run absolutely wild. And there was another, even more convenient, exception. The Irish. If you were Irish, the rules of quarter simply didn't apply. Parliament even passed an ordinance in 1644 making it official policy. Because nothing says fighting for liberty like legalizing ethnic cleansing. Enter Prince Rupert of the Rhine, nephew to King Charles I, and the Royalists' rock star cavalry commander. He was also famously impatient. In May 1644, he arrived at the town of Bolton, a Puritan stronghold nicknamed the Geneva of the North. They, rather unwisely, refused to surrender. After a brief and brutal assault, Rupert's forces, including regiments fresh from the horrors of the 30 Years' War, poured into the streets. What followed was the Bolton Massacre. Over 1,500 people, including defenders and civilians, were killed in a frenzy of violence. The Royalists called it a great service. The parliamentarians called it barbarous cruelty. It seems perspective is everything when you're the one holding the sword. The interesting thing about Bolton wasn't just the killing, but the sheer unadulterated greed. The town was a center for textile manufacturing, which meant it was wealthy. Rupert's soldiers, who were chronically underpaid, saw the town not just as an enemy stronghold, but as a giant, Puritan-filled piggy bank. Accounts describe soldiers literally tripping over bodies in the streets because they were so burdened with looted cloth and goods. The parliamentarian propagandist John Vickers claimed ropes were tied from one side of the street to the other to trip up fleeing civilians, making them easier to kill and rob. It was a masterclass in combining ideological hatred with a keen eye for personal profit, a truly timeless human skill. 1 year later, in May 1645, Rupert decided to repeat his success at the strategically important town of Leicester. Again, the town refused to surrender. You'd think news traveled in the 17th century, but apparently not. The Royalists blew a massive hole in the wall and poured in. And again, the result was a massacre. The town was systematically plundered, with Parliament claiming hundreds of civilians, including women and children, were killed in their own homes. King Charles himself was present, watching from a safe distance, which must have been a lovely morale booster for the men doing the slaughtering. He even wrote a cheerful letter to his wife about the rich plunder his soldiers had acquired. Truly a king of the people. The sacking of Leicester was a great victory for the Royalists. It lasted about 2 weeks. Because just 14 days later, on June 14th, 1645, the main Royalist army was utterly annihilated by Parliament's new model army at the Battle of Naseby. This is a beautiful piece of historical irony. The Royalist army, slowed down by carts overflowing with loot from Leicester, was decisively crushed. Their great atrocity directly contributed to their greatest military disaster. It's almost as if there's a cosmic force that dislikes it when you murder a town's population and steal all their stuff. Or, more likely, it's just that heavy carts of stolen silver don't move very fast when a disciplined professional army is bearing down on you. But the horror wasn't over. After the battle, the victorious parliamentarians captured the Royalist baggage train. Inside, they found the army's camp followers, including around 100 Welsh women. The soldiers, hearing them speak Welsh and mistaking it for Irish, assumed they were Irish Catholic prostitutes. Let's just pause and appreciate the layers of prejudice required for that leap of logic. The result was sickening. The women were brutally killed or deliberately mutilated, with soldiers slitting their noses or branding their cheeks to mark them as whores. This wasn't a military action. It was a psychotic explosion of misogyny and xenophobia, all because they couldn't tell the difference between two Celtic languages. A bad day to be a linguist. Now we come to the main event of English Civil War atrocities, Oliver Cromwell's 1649 campaign in Ireland. This wasn't just a sideshow. For Cromwell, it was God's work. He arrived with the new model army to crush the alliance of Irish Confederates and English Royalists. First stop, the walled town of Drogheda. The garrison, a mix of English and Irish troops commanded by an Englishman, Sir Arthur Aston, refused to surrender. Big mistake. Cromwell's forces breached the walls on September 11th and were given the order for no quarter. What followed was, in Cromwell's own words, a righteous judgment of God. Around 3,500 people were killed, including the entire garrison and an unknown number of civilians and Catholic priests. Apparently, God is very particular about siege etiquette. Cromwell didn't hide what happened. He wrote about it in detail to Parliament. He described soldiers and priests being killed in the streets and in their churches. He mentions about 1,000 people taking refuge in the steeple of St. Peter's Church. Cromwell ordered his men to set the steeple on fire, burning them all alive. He wrote, "I am persuaded that this is a righteous judgment of God upon these barbarous wretches." He argued that this brutality was actually a kindness, as it would terrify other towns into surrendering quickly, thus shortening the war. It's a stunning piece of psychological gymnastics, committing a war crime and framing it as a public service. A month later at Wexford, a similar massacre occurred, this time almost by accident, when troops broke in during surrender negotiations. Things just kept accidentally escalating. But the Irish weren't the only ones to feel the wrath of the new model army. In 1650, Cromwell invaded Scotland to deal with the Scots who had, rather awkwardly, crowned Charles II as their king. At the Battle of Dunbar, Cromwell won a stunning victory against a much larger Scottish army, taking around 10,000 prisoners. The problem was what to do with them. His solution was a forced march south towards England in the dead of winter with almost no food or water. This wasn't a massacre with swords, but with calculated neglect. It was administrative murder. Thousands died of starvation, disease, and exposure along the way. It was a logistical nightmare that turned into a human catastrophe, all because nobody had planned for what to do after winning. The surviving Scottish prisoners, around 3,000 of them, were eventually imprisoned in Durham Cathedral, a grand, holy place turned into a makeshift prison camp. Except there was no food, no sanitation, and no warmth. The desperate prisoners started burning the cathedral's wooden furnishings and carvings to stay alive. Within months, another 17 of them had died from malnutrition and dysentery. They were unceremoniously dumped into a mass grave on the grounds. For centuries, this was just a local story. Then, in 2013, construction workers found them. Archaeologists uncovered the jumbled skeletons of dozens of young men, the physical proof of this forgotten atrocity. A final, silent testimony to the consequences of winning a battle. So, the English Civil War wasn't a simple conflict between two clear-cut sides. It was a chaotic mess of political ambition, religious fanaticism, and sheer bloody-minded opportunism. The massacres at places like Bolton, Drogheda, and the Death March from Dunbar weren't aberrations. They were the logical endpoint of a conflict where the enemy wasn't just wrong, but evil, subhuman, and undeserving of mercy. We like to wrap these events in the noble language of liberty and monarchy, but on the ground it was often just about grabbing whatever you could and killing whoever got in your way. It's a comforting thought, isn't it, that we've evolved so much since then. We've certainly gotten much better at creating propaganda to justify it all. If you enjoyed this video, please like, comment, and subscribe to our channel for more historical insights. Thanks for watching, nerds!